April 1945, Northern Italy. The war that had seemed endless was collapsing in a scatter of orders and smoke. Fields that had once held harvest now held equipment abandoned in haste, and the roads carried men with hollowed faces toward whatever came next. On a low ridge above a hamlet of stone and tile, Communication Station 7 sat half buried against the slope, a squat bunker of concrete and wire whose radio mast leaned like a tired sentinel. Inside, the machines had fallen quiet. Outside, the horizon had the thin, hard light that came before rain. It was there, in that narrow place between earth and sky, that a small human decision would ripple outward for decades. If this story holds your attention, stay with it until the end. There is a short scene that follows these pages, and if it moves you, subscribing and sharing helps keep stories like this alive. Stay to the close. The quiet things, broth, a blanket, a promise, matter more than you might expect. The bunker had been meant for radios and code, not the human cargo it now sheltered. A skeleton crew of German signalers and 2 women who operated ciphers remained when most had fled or been reassigned. They moved carefully, their hands learning anew the economy of motion that hunger forces upon the body. The commanding sergeant, Weber, kept a ledger of supplies and a small, dark patience. Ilse Brandt and Franz Lehmann, names that sounded like the worn ribbons of music, kept their faces steady as they fed the machine and pretended not to notice the way the women slept in shifts, curling like small, dry leaves beneath blankets. They had been found by a patrol of the American 34th Infantry Division on a slope of loose gravel and scrub. The jeep had been driven hard, men eager for shelter and a brief respite from the open road. Corporal James Mitchell, 22, with his sleeves rolled and hands that already remembered the rhythm of a factory lathe from before he was a soldier, was the first to go down the slope. He moved with that peculiar directness a factory worker learns. See a task, approach it, set shoulders to it. He had a sister back home who kept a ledger at the machinist shop. He had written once in an awkward, cramped hand that he would return to the blueprints and the humming press. He had also promised, in a letter folded under the heel of a boot, to come back whole. That promise sat on his chest like a small coin, brass and familiar, and informed, in quiet ways, the choices he made. They found the entrance by accident. The mouth of the bunker breathed cold air, and where the light reached inside, a cluster of forms lay on wooden pallets and concrete. The air smelled of damp wool and something deeper, an absence of food that had taken on its own odor. They were Germans, thin as the memory of food, their eyes wide and raw. One woman did not look like the others. She lay with her cheek to the floor, and seemed to be listening to the sound of her own breath, as if measuring it for the small courage needed to take another. Mitchell crouched before her because that was where his hands went, forward when someone needed steadiness. He had learned as a boy how to set a wheel true beneath a lathe, how to align a faceplate until it ran even. There was a patience in him for things that required small, repeated attention. He touched the woman's wrist. It was paper thin, the vein like a thread visible under the skin. Her eyelids fluttered. She did not fix her gaze on him. When she spoke, the sound was a sliver of language, the consonants uncertain, the vowels thin, but the words had a name: Katharina. Mitchell, he told the sergeant later, when he had to say something that would be recorded as an explanation, she was alive, barely. We couldn't leave her. Words like that traveled awkwardly through the chain of command. The Americans had orders to secure infrastructure, to process prisoners, to take intelligence. There was a collection point south in a valley where the wounded and displaced were to be sorted, a medical echelon that could not be delayed by sentiment. Captain Friedman and Sergeant Paul Rivera, who ran the battalion aid station in a converted farmhouse, had charts and pragmatism. They knew that a single soldier staying behind could compromise the unit's readiness. Yet there are moments when procedure fractures against what a man sees. "We have a ration detail leaving at dawn," the captain said, making the lines of his mouth into a map of the battlefield. "We can't leave men behind to babysit." "You don't have to call it babysitting," Danny Cohen said, half joking to loosen the room. He was younger than Mitchell and had a lopsided grin that made him younger still. "Call it duty of humanity." It was easy, in the fog of war, for duty to wear many faces. To some, duty meant the ledger and the march. To others, duty meant the person who would not answer if left alone. This was the point where Mitchell's choice pressed itself into the script of his life. He asked permission to stay. He framed it without melodrama. He spoke of a promise that felt, to him, small and binding. "If I stay," he told Friedman, "I'll be responsible for her until you're ready to move her. I won't hold the unit up." Friedman looked at him as a man examines a tool, useful if handled properly, liable to failure if not. "No guarantees," the captain said. "You stay at your risk. If you compromise the company, you'll answer." Mitchell said yes. He had no sense then of how long the yes would last, or that it would become, in the ledger of his life, a hinge around which other things turned. He moved into the bunker with a blanket in his pack and an appetite for small, practical acts. The immediate world of care is modest. Fetch water, boil it, strain it until the broth is clear. Make a ladle out of a tin can. Warm the blanket with body heat and keep sweat from clinging to thin skin. He set his hands to those tasks as if to a machine with one speed, methodical and repetitive. Katharina's eyes, when she could open them, were a pale, unsteady blue. Her name was said in the room with a careful reverence, as if the syllable itself might be fragile. She had been 19, 20 at most. No older than the girls who worked the cipher tables, yet with a face that knowledge had pressed thin. Her voice, when she managed it, was a whisper threaded with German that had a few English traces. "Wasser," she would say, or "broth," and Mitchell learned the cadence. Ilse and France, who had guarded themselves with a brittle civility amid the humiliation of their station, watched him with an appraisal that meant, "What will this American do that others would not?" The first day was a question of keeping the heart steady. The medic's instructions were cautious. Sergeant Rivera, who had seen more than his share of the body's betrayals, explained it in the farmhouse's small tent with a bluntness that was practical rather than cruel. "Start with fluids," he said. "Warm broth, small sips. No big meals. Too much too soon, her body might not take it. We call it refeeding risk. The balance in electrolytes can shift. Watch for swelling, confusion. If she tolerates, slow increase." Mitchell listened, nodded like a man at a station's briefing. He did not pretend to be a doctor, but he had a mother who had known the value of steady work and a sister who could keep a ledger. He understood the rhythm of slow repair. In the morning, he strained broth over a cloth and held a cup to Katharina's lips. He coaxed in tiny sips, and where the body had become a closed fist, small openings appeared, softened cheek, a long exhalation. The broth's steam smelled of base sustenance and something else, the human ritual of being warmed, the brief comfort of salt and hot liquid. There were moments when she reacted with something like shame. "Warum?" she asked once, the question loose and raw. Why would an enemy do this? It was a question that hung between them, not seeking an answer so much as giving voice to the bewilderment of being spared. Mitchell did not have a theological answer. He had a memory of his father saying, when a neighbor's roof caved in during a storm, "You help them. That's how you keep the world from getting smaller." He said, simply, "Because you were there." In the nights, she dreamed. Mitchell learned the shape of those dreams in the way she would flinch and breathe, and sometimes she would wake and speak in a voice that belonged to no one place. "The wires are alive," she would say. "They talk." Once, in fractured English, she said, "My brother, he is," and left it unfinished. He could imagine the brother as a child, a man, a rumor swallowed by war. He could not fix which she had lost, but he could hold the cup steady. Word traveled back to the company like a slow rumor. Some men mocked. Humor is a shield in war. Danny Cohen teased Mitchell for his sentimental pause. "You're going soft, Jimmy. Next thing you'll want to knit her a sweater." The joke landed against the bunker walls and fell apart. Others, quieter, brought cigarettes and extra blankets. There were small rebellions of tenderness. A soldier who had plundered a tin of condensed milk slipped a spoonful into the broth. An operator left a stack of code books for Katharina to turn the pages of, as if that act could remind her of ordinary engagements with time. The moral friction came not as grand arguments, but as the accumulation of small resistances. When Captain Friedman came down to require the paperwork for transfer, he found Mitchell at the head of a makeshift cot, humming a machine song that belonged to his factory memory. The captain watched Katharina breathe, and then watched Mitchell's hands, and something like understanding passed across his features. He rectified the forms, made notes, arranged for collection. But the captain's face also held a practical gravity. The theater of war had rules that were not erased by need. "You did the right thing," he said to Mitchell, "but you know what it's worth to the company if you stay too long." Mitchell did not stay forever. There were limits of manpower, and the company could not be held idle. When the convoy arrived to take the wounded to the battalion aid station, Mitchell walked beside the jeep with Katharina swaddled in a blanket that smelled faintly of his own jacket. He had used the phrase, once, to secure her trust, an awkward, possessive-sounding thing that men sometimes say in extremes of care. "You're mine now," he had told her, and the words landed not as ownership, but as an offer of custody. "I will keep you safe." She repeated the phrase once, almost to hear it, and Mitchell felt a duty attached to syllables. At the aid station, the world shifted into a different vocabulary. The farmhouse smelled of disinfectant and boiled milk. Nurses moved with a brisk competence that had no room for sentimentality. On the other hand, they were not blind to the fragile arithmetic of survival. Drip lines could be set if the unit had saline. Plain broth would be the first daily nourishment. Bed rest and observation would be the regimen. Captain Friedman met with the medical officer and arranged for Katharina's placement on a cot, while Mitchell stood in the tent and spoke to Dr. Rivera in a halting, earnest way about what to do next. "She'll need slow introduction to solids," Rivera said. "If she eats too much, she could be in real trouble. We don't want to see her fail after she pulls back from the edge." Mitchell accepted that as a challenge to his patients. The task of mercy is boring to the dramatic eye. It is a matter of making tiny calculus of calories and comfort. He sat by Katharina's cot for long stretches, holding her hand, feeling the bone beneath the skin like a tool's worn surface. He read scraps from a pocketbook, recounted the small weather back home, tried to tell stories that would build a scaffold of ordinary time around the hollowed places in her memory. Letters began the slow journeying of their story into something that could cross a calendar. In a cramped handwriting that tilted with the motion of a train, Katharina would later write, years after the farmstead tent, "You kept me. You kept me alive when everything else was being taken." Those lines would arrive in Michigan 6 years later, addressed to a name she had learned from the soldier who stayed. James Mitchell, C.O. Mrs. H. Mitchell, 214 Maple Street. The letter was the smallest of miracles, a folded paper that carried her voice across continents, a proof that a promise had been recorded in ink and therefore, supposedly, in world. But the immediate season involved waiting lists and processing tents. Katharina was moved to Camp Ruston, a temporary collection point where displaced persons were gathered before decisions were made about repatriation or transfer. Mitchell, meanwhile, had paperwork and duty. The military's logic is to reassign men where need dictates. He petitioned to be attached as a caretaker for the duration of her stay in the collection point, arguing that she would be less likely to relapse if someone who knew her habits remained. Friedman, who had seen men break under less mournful pressure, signed the order with a fine-line caution that meant the Army would not hold him responsible for acts of conscience beyond the chain of command. The collection point was a place of muted faces and waiting. Tents lined the field like exhausted teeth, and a line of mothers carried infants bound in shawls. Katharina sat on a wooden crate and watched others move. She would occasionally count items in her hands, a button, a scrap of cloth, perhaps to anchor herself to the fact of small things. Mitchell brought her broth each morning, and a spoonful of porridge as she allowed. The staff kept a careful sheet of intake and output. They noted the absence of edema and the slow return of color. Each tiny improvement made them both cautious and hopeful. The medical officer, a man who preferred the clarity of charts to the ambiguity of gestures, said once, "We're seeing baby steps. Keep doing what you're doing. The rest will follow." Letters traveled in both directions during this time. Mitchell wrote to his mother about the weather and about a job he had taken on that was not in any manual but which required him to stay up at night and watch a woman's chest rise. He never wrote with rhetorical flourish. His sentences were plain. "She is getting better," he wrote, "and I will do what I can. Please don't tell Grace yet. She worries. I'll be home when I'm able." Grace was his fiancée. His handwriting trembled over her name, as if the pen carried the gravity of two lives. He did not, in these letters, fully name what it cost him to be compassionate in a war that demanded efficiency. The private ledger of personal sacrifice would be reconciled later, in a slow calculus of life. Katharina, when she could gather strength, wrote in a journal she had been given by a volunteer. Short, clipped sentences at first, then longer as her hand grew steadier. "A man with rough hands gave me broth," one entry reads in translation. "He is from America. I did not think they were this." The sentence trails into an ellipsis that suggests bewilderment and gratitude braided together. She wrote of the sound of the piano someone had found in the ruins of a villa, and of the smell of lemon soap in the laundry tent. Her handwriting showed a renewal of muscle and steadiness, an echo of the small rebuilding of a life that begins with scent and the sound of a spoon against a tin cup. Not all days bore improvement. There were nights when she vomited and fell limply into a hush that made the tent feel larger and lonelier. Mitchell knew enough to call the medic and to check for the indicators they had been warned about. The medic came and adjusted the fluid schedule, and kept the watchful eye that the Army lends to physical bodies, to ensure they do not depart too quickly. That the recovery was slow was not a failure but a truth. Bodies recalibrate in their own time, and Mercy's work is to hold the steady pace. When the time came for transfer to a processing point where Katharina would be sorted among civilians and possible repatriation, Mitchell had to make a decision that would feel again like a hinge. He could contest the orders and attempt to secure a longer attachment, but military need pressed. Captain Friedman offered him leave to accompany her as far as the collection point, but not beyond. The company required his return. The choice rested on the measure of a promise and the practicalities of movement. Mitchell chose to see her as far as the collection point and to leave a letter that would direct any follow-up to his family back home. He left a small bundle of things: a repaired fountain pen he had polished at night, a photograph of his sister in front of the lathe, and a note that said, "You have my name. If anything happens, tell them James Mitchell stayed." The convoy took them down a road streaked with mud and the crushed remains of hedgerows. Villagers watched from behind curtained windows. Some lifted their hands in gestures that might have been gratitude, others looked away. At the collection point, amid the press and the noise, a young boy with a freckled face ran past and collided with Mitchell's knee. The boy's mother admonished him, and then their eyes met in a small, brief serenity that such collisions sometimes produce, a reminder that life went on in odd proximity to ruin. They parted with no ceremony. Katharina, who had learned to trust the rhythm of Mitchell's touch, reached up and touched his cheek with a feathery finger. It was a gesture of thanks and of acknowledgement that her life now contained a man whose name would travel with her. He tightened his grip on the strap of his pack and watched her recede into the throng. He could not know then the future that would be built on that small human exchange. Letters folded into envelopes, vows made quietly and with some fear. Children who would carry names as inheritances of mercy. The weeks after their parting were a litany of small obligations. Mitchell returned to his company's rotation and to the duties that defined his soldierly days. He wrote letters that sometimes were so plain as to be a kind of prayer. "I saw her sitting in the sun. She smiled. Keep the house warm for me." He did not expect a reply for a time. But in the months following, letters began to arrive. Crisp, penned in German and translated by the volunteer staff. Sometimes a single sentence, sometimes a page. The first letter that reached him bore a shaky hand and a phrase that lodged itself in his mind. "I have bread again. I have work." It was Katharina's voice, a thin but steady line across the ocean. The correspondence developed into a network, volunteers who translated and forwarded, Red Cross offices that redirected addresses, Mitchell's mother who kept a careful watch at 214 Maple Street and answered the letters in a mixture of caution and maternal warmth. The letters allowed the two to keep building, across distance, that delicate scaffolding of small things. Who made the tea? Which days were cold? What the children in the neighborhood were dreaming about. In the margins of the affair of nations, these quotidian details knit the extraordinary into something ordinary. There was, in the years that followed, a slow unfolding that involved both legalities and private courage. The American forces, with their procedures, could facilitate relatives' transfer in some instances. There were interviews and proofs, questions about allegiances, and what Katharina had or had not done during the war. She answered truthfully, in the crisp lines of someone who had been pressed by ideology and had been spared by circumstance. The legalistic interrogation was a net that could have caught her. Instead, it loosened slowly under evidence of her non-combatant status and under the weight of testimony from the men who had found her. Mitchell's letters were part testimony, part pleading, plain words that said, in effect, "I ask that she be allowed a chance." Time passed in ways that have nothing to do with calendars. A marriage license came into being in a small office somewhere in the States in late 1947. The certificate was a thin paper declaring that two names had been joined, and the clause felt both legal and intimate. They married quietly. Mitchell in a pressed uniform that still smelled faintly of motor oil. Katharina in a dress made by a woman who ran a seamstress shop out of her parlor. Friends from the company attended, as did a few volunteers who had stayed in touch. Tickets and transport had been arranged through channels that were polite and bureaucratic and utterly human at the same time. The child, who would later be known as Jakob, was born in a room near the factory where Mitchell would eventually take a job again. The child carried, in his name, an echo of his mother's past and a hope that had traveled across the ocean. Mitchell worked at the lathe and kept his hands steady. He found, in the machine's hum, the same rhythm he had used to steady a woman's pulse in a bunker. Katharina, who had once been a faint outline of survival, learned to tend a garden and to speak English with a patience that softened her accent but never erased the truth of where she had come from. Letters continued to play a role in their lives. Katharina wrote to Ilsa and to France, to women who had shared the narrowness of the bunker and who were scattered across a continent that was trying to re-knit itself. There were notes to Captain Friedman and to Dr. Rivera, thanking them for the small legalities and medical steadfastness that had been necessary in the beginning. She wrote to Mitchell's mother with the hesitance of someone who knows what it is to ask for acceptance. In time, the letters were answered with recipes and household advice and photographs of family gatherings. The moral ledger of the story is not a ledger of neat credits and debits. There were costs that no accounting could reconcile. The years when Katharina's sleep was broken by nightmares of wires. The afternoons when Mitchell would wake with his hand clenched and recall the sound of a code key being banged in a room that no longer existed. There were community whispers, too. Neighbors who did not fully understand why a man from the village would marry a woman whose past signal had once aligned with the enemy. They met those silences with quiet consistency. The warmth of a saved bread, the steadiness of a child fed and clothed, the unremarkable routine of morning coffee. In later decades, as families tend to do, they preserved a few artifacts. A photograph of Mitchell crouched beside the bunker, taken by a soldier who had a camera and an eye for moments, lived in the parlor of their home. The image showed a young man with his hand on a woman's shoulder. The eyes of both were turned away from the camera as if toward an uncertain horizon. Katharina kept a journal through the years, her hands steady now, the entries a mixture of household notes and the memory of a day when broth had tasted like a promise. When Jakob was old enough to ask about the war, about the stories that had shaped his parents, Mitchell told him not as a sermon, but as a recounting of factual smallness. There was a woman in a bunker. She was starving. Someone stayed. The son grew into a man who understood the power of a private mercy. He would, decades later, come to a memorial unveiling in the village near the old bunker, standing where his mother once lay. The town had raised a small plaque, humble words that honored the civilian lives affected by the conflict and acknowledged acts of compassion that had preserved them. Jakob traced the letters with his finger and felt, in that tactile motion, a continuity between the past and the present. Letters continued to arrive across the years. Short, fond notes from Ilsa, a photograph from France showing a garden she planted, a postcard from Captain Friedman that said, simply, "You did well." The letters were not trophies. They were, rather, witness. They documented the human law that sometimes operates outside bureaucracy. A man staying past his orders. A woman given a blanket and broth. A life that, in consequence, unfolded in ordinary hospitality. In reflecting on the arc of that life, the moral weight rests less upon the scale of the act than upon the fact that someone noticed. The world is full of passages that permit leaving. The rarer gift is the one who lingers. Mitchell's choice to stay in a slope of concrete and wire was not a heroic headline. It was a small, steady devotion. To strain broth until it ran clean, to listen when a woman spoke of wires, to keep a hand on a wrist that felt as thin as parchment. Those actions, repeated and unremarkable, accumulated into a legacy that was tangible in the childhood of Jakob, in the garden Katharina planted, in the photograph in the parlor. There is, in such stories, a temptation to seek grand symbols. Yet the recurring images, broth steaming over a tin cup, a blanket folded and weighted with human warmth, the slow glide of a pen across paper, carry their own gravity. They are not metaphors that rise above the scene, they are the scene. When Jacob later stood before the plaque and read the wording aloud, he spoke of a man who had chosen responsibility in the smallest possible terms. The crowd listened in a hush that was less about ceremony than recognition. History often records the sweep of events in categories and dates, in strategies and movements. But the moral filament that informs how societies rebuild is frequently finer. A soldier who stays once and keeps his watch. A woman who learns to plant seeds again. Letters that turn strangers into sustained obligations. Acts of mercy are not always public. They are private economies where the currency is time and patience. Mitchell lived long enough to see Jacob become a man with his own family, to see the garden grow, and to watch from a porch that had been added to their modest home the world shift its colors with the seasons. Katharina's hair silvered, and the nightmares diminished into the occasional twilight disturbance. They kept letters folded in a shoebox beneath the bed, brittle pages that smelled faintly of dust and lavender. The photograph of the bunker, yellowed around the edges, occupied a place of modest prominence. In quiet evenings, Mitchell would take it down and trace the shape of his younger self. He would think of the machinery he had once tended, and the way his hands had learned to steady what was fragile. When he died, years later, in a hospital room where machines hummed in an unthreatening way and nurses moved with calm competence, the community gathered. The memorial service was not grandiose. It consisted of a handful of men who had been with him, a neighbor who had always borrowed sugar and returned it with a smile, a woman who had been a volunteer translator who spoke of the power of small acts. Jacob read a letter his mother had written decades before and kept folded in her Bible. The letter reiterated the simple truth: "He kept me." At the unveiling of a small plaque near the old bunker, the mayor, careful to use words that were gentle and appropriate, spoke of the ways ordinary choices shape extraordinary outcomes. The plaque did not attempt to rewrite history, it simply recorded a fact: that a young American soldier stayed with a starving woman in April 1945 and that she lived. People left flowers, simple sprigs of rosemary and wildflowers, on the rough stone. Some bent their heads, some spoke quietly to one another, others stood with their hands in pockets and listened to the wind move through the grass. The story's moral is not a platform for judgment, but an invitation to attention. Small acts require courage and cost. They ask us to recalibrate what counts as duty. In an age when the scales of history are measured in battalions and treaties, it is worth remembering that the arc of human recovery is also bent by single persons who choose to stay. Years later, in a letter sorted into a shoebox among others, Jacob wrote to his children, "There is a photograph of a young man on a ridge in Italy. He looks at the world and chooses, once, to keep a woman's life. That choice made us." The sentence is modest and true. Mercy, shown in the ordinary motion of a hand pouring broth, has a tendency to outlast declarations and decrees. It becomes, across generations, a quiet inheritance. The bunker on the ridge remains on maps as a relic. Now grass grows where troops once marched. Locals told stories of the night when lights were left on through the long cold, of blankets shared, of a cup passed with patient hands. In the end, the lasting thing was not the structure, but the habit it inspired: to look small and see the person who needs you. That habit had its own architecture: letters, a porch, a garden, a child's laughter. And those things, in their sum, were the measure of a mercy that continued to give. The years folded into one another with a steadiness that surprised those who liked to measure time by headlines and not by habits. The plaque near the bunker became a place where people went with small pockets of intent: to remember a life, to mark a debt, to touch the cool metal with a fingertip. School children came on field trips and were taught, in a manner that tried to be both honest and digestible, that sometimes the map of history is drawn by decisions too small to fit on a textbook page. A local teacher, stooped and practical, and fond of metaphors she could explain without floridness, would ask her pupils to name a small act of mercy they had done that week. The answers were not dramatic. A pencil lent, a sandwich shared, a homework explained at kitchen tables. The teacher kept a jar in the classroom in which those small acts were written down on slips of paper and folded like tiny treasures. At the end of the year the jar was opened and the room smelled faintly of 1,000 ordinary kindnesses. Jacob watched these rituals with a guarded pleasure. He did not relish public attention. His writing of the letter to his children had been a private acquiescence to the fact that memory needed anchors. Still, he found himself drawn, more than once, to the spot where Mitchell had stood years before, on a ridge now with grass and daisies and a few veterans who liked to lean against weathered stones and remember in their own particular cadence. He would stand there and imagine the younger men and women who had once been pressed like coins under the boot of war, and he would think of the odd way a life is sometimes saved by the insistence of another to do the next small thing rather than the heroic thing. When his children were grown, they collected the letters, the photograph, and the brittle pages that smelled of lavender and dust into a single chest. There were conversations, slow, careful, sometimes heated, about what it meant to inherit a story. Jacob's son, named for his grandfather, wanted the photograph displayed prominently in his own home. Jacob's daughter, quieter and practical, folded the letters and kept them in a chum of box that she carried across borders on holiday trips. They argued gently over what details to tell their children, deciding together that truth should not be softened into legend, nor should every nuance be paraded as if it owed their family favor. The shoebox itself gained a history. Once, at a summer family gathering, a neighbor's boy opened it and found a letter that had never been read aloud at any memorial. The boy, a freckled child with persistent curiosity, rushed it to Jacob and asked why no one had ever said the words inside. Jacob took the paper, his hands larger and slower now, and read. It was a reply from Mitchell that had been mailed years after the war and ambivalently saved. In that letter, Mitchell had written not of medals or politics, but of mornings, of the way dawn tasted in shallow cups of coffee, of the small negligence of going on patrol, and of the tiny insistence that makes a life stay. He had confessed, in his quiet way, that he had been afraid of failing to do enough, and that staying felt like the only honest antidote. The letter offered no heroic manifesto. It offered regrets, tender, human, and gratitude. "I don't know what to name what I felt," he had written, "only that it was like a hand placed on a shoulder and not moving, and then I kept holding." Jacob's hands trembled when he finished. The tremor was not from grief alone, but from the continued surprise at how small, uncertain things make the scaffolding of a life. There were, inevitably, voices that resisted the simplicity of such stories. A historian once wrote an essay that reached beyond the town, arguing that individual acts, while morally commendable, can also be used to neatly absolve larger, more complicated systems. The piece was careful and necessary, reminding readers that mercy should not erase responsibility. And it irritated some townspeople who felt the essay's tone pushed nuance into cynicism. The debate that followed was gentle for the most part, but honest. At a cafe meeting, two men argued about whether commemorations should include the complex forces that led to the bunker and to starvation, while a woman at the edge of the table wept quietly because the argument made her feel like the story of her grandmother was being converted into an academic exercise. Jacob understood both points. Mercy, he knew, did not contest the structures of injustice. It was dissent within them, yes, but it did not replace the need for justice. Still, he would sometimes say, private words to his family, that the stubbornness of an ordinary choice has power precisely because it is ordinary. It resists the temptation to simplify. It is complicated in that it is personal, and so it refuses to appear tidy in a volume of collected essays. Years brought new rituals that pressed the story into the public imagination. An artist from the city proposed a mural on a community hall wall, a continuous river of small scenes, a cup, a blanket, a hand, a garden gate, painted in muted pastels that suggested time and weather rather than colorfulness. The mural was debated at public meetings, where people spoke of taste and cost and memory. In the end, it was painted, and children would run their palms across the painted cup and pretend it was solid. An elderly woman who had once been a volunteer translator cut the ribbon at the unveiling and called the mural a language for people who could not read. The artist, who had never met Mitchell, described how he had been moved by the notion of an economy of staying, and how that idea felt like a fissure in more bombastic narratives. Incidents of misunderstanding surfaced as well. A journalist wrote a feature that, in pursuit of drama, suggested romantic motives where there were none. The family bristled. Jakob's daughter called the reporter and corrected the record. She insisted that tenderness was not the same as romance, that small acts can be without fanfare and still be entire. The public correction was later edited into a calmer piece. The journalist's eagerness cooled into a more patient curiosity. What persisted through all these reinterpretations and rewritings was the shoebox and the photograph and the garden. Gardens have a grammar that resists rhetoric. You sow, you water, you wait. Katharina's garden, tended first by her and then by neighbors who had learned the value of the small enterprise, taught that one may cultivate life without claiming authorship of every bloom. Children learned to pull weeds and to know the names of herbs. Mitchell's granddaughter, who had a habit of visiting and bringing a quilt, would sit on the porch and tell small, unimportant stories of the man who had once kept his hands steady in the dark. The bunker itself, stripped of its grim purpose and folded into the landscape as a humbly handsome ruin, became a place where different generations registered their presence in their own ways. Teenagers took photographs in front of the plaque, sometimes with ironic captions that older visitors did not always understand. A college professor used the site for a seminar on moral philosophy. A choir practiced hymns nearby one afternoon and let the sound unspool across the field until passers-by stopped and listened. On one autumn afternoon, when the sky had that particular hard clarity that makes everything seem sharper, Jakob's granddaughter, lean and quick with the look of his son and the patience of his daughter, came up the path with a child of her own, a boy whose attention flickered from bug to stone to the plaque. She tucked a small ceramic cup into her pocket, one she had found at a flea market, chipped at the rim and plain, and explained, in a voice both casual and reverent, why they would lay it at the stone. The boy listened, nodding, accepting the rite like one accepts a rule in a game. They arrived to find a woman sitting on the low wall, hands folded in a way that suggested both memory and the everyday station of waiting. She introduced herself as the organizer of the community garden, and told them she had known Katharina in later years. Jakob's granddaughter said little. She preferred to move with the ritual. The cup was placed near the plaque with a small sprig of rosemary, and the child dropped a pebble into the hollow of the cup, solemn as a small priest. "Who put that there?" asked the boy, peering curiously at the curled edge of the photograph tucked in the shoebox on a nearby bench. "Someone who chose to keep," said the organizer, and the words fell light as bread. People come to names and to objects because they are capable of holding the weight of things too complicated to say aloud. Later, sitting in the organizer's kitchen with tea, Jakob's granddaughter leafed through the letters they had brought from the shoebox. One was a card from a nurse who had been at Mitchell's deathbed, short and exact, praising the simple steadiness of his letters and of his quiet attentions to others in the ward. Another was a note from a neighbor from the town that had once hosted soldiers and refugees, who confessed to having been too young to understand everything then, but who carried the memory forward nonetheless. In that kitchen, a discussion took shape about inheritance. What does one pass on when what one has is a story that is both personal and communal? The organizer spoke of how the garden now fed several elderly residents who couldn't walk to market, how neighbors exchanged produce and recipes in a rotation that felt like a living testament to the same economy of small mercies. Jakob's granddaughter said she wanted to teach her son the letters, to make them a kind of oral curriculum that included not only the facts of what had happened, but the decisions that had made life possible. There was a fragile reconciliation, too, between memory and public record. A scholar activist from a nearby university proposed a small archive, a digital collection where scanned copies of letters, photographs, and oral testimonies could be kept with contextual essays that made clear the structural injustices that had preceded any acts of kindness. The town council debated the idea. Some feared loss of privacy. Others welcomed the possibility of teaching more demanding histories to future generations. Jakob's family agreed, with the stipulation that the archive should not efface the human particulars. The scholar nodded, as if acknowledging that the archive's true task was to host both the wide lens and the intimate detail. And so an archive was formed, modest and lovingly curated, with volunteers who learned to scan brittle paper without tearing it and to tag the materials with patient keywords like meal, blanket, watch, and garden. A young history student, bright and often anxious about the weight of narratives, interviewed Katharina's niece and recorded her voice as she read aloud a letter that had once been tucked behind the Bible. The student's project was later presented to a small audience who sat in folding chairs and let the voice travel through the room like a benediction. The student, who had grown up in a city far from the ridge, said at the close of her talk that she had learned something she had not found in textbooks: the steady power of obligation that does not seek to be known. Sometimes, in the slow hours before dusk, the townspeople who had been adolescents during the war would gather for small suppers and tell stories that were less about grand strategy and more about the texture of living amidst ration cards and blackouts. They spoke of neighbors who shared bread and of a door left open in a storm. These tales were cyclical, almost liturgical, each retelling like a stitch reinforcing the memory. Mitchell's name came up, always, not as a talisman, but as a node in a network of small decisions. Jakob, as he grew older, began to feel his own life as a sequence of handed things. The photograph that others now asked to see. The letter folded always in the same creases. The garden that now belonged to a composite of hands. There were afternoons when he would sit on the porch and listen to the world, children calling across yards, the occasional hum of a distant tractor, and feel at once an enormous gratitude and a small private sorrow for all the other things that had not been kept. He did not brood over losses like a ledger. He simply acknowledged them, naming them to himself like a prayer. When he died, older than Mitchell had lived, but still carried by the same modest dignity, the town gathered again. The memorial was plain, a circle of voices and hands and a reading of a letter that had been saved for such a moment. Jakob's granddaughter read aloud from the shoebox. The passage where Jakob had written that the photograph of a young man on a ridge was a family not because of blood alone, but because of a refusal to leave. The words landed softly among the listeners like seeds. After the service, someone suggested, quietly at first, that the plaque be accompanied by a bench where people could sit. The idea was simple: to give space for small acts of remembering that lasted longer than a standing visit. Donations came in the amounts people could offer. Some gave more for reasons private to them. Some gave a loaf or a jar of preserves. The bench was placed beneath a young maple that had been planted by children years before. Its shade now provided comfort during summers and a fluttering, seasonal confetti for autumn. Time continued its patient work. Children who had once been taught to write down their small acts grew into adults who repeated forms of mercy with their own faces. The practice of writing kindness remained oddly stubborn and necessary. The archives grew, the mural faded, and the plaque remained, steady as a fact. Tourists came less frequently than one might imagine. Mostly it was local people who tended to the site as they tended to the garden. Their gestures were particular and sometimes clumsy, always human. Once, long after Mitchell had died, a young soldier visiting with his partner stood near the bunker and read the plaque aloud. He was not there to honor a legend so much as to remember a course correction he wanted for himself. He confessed, in a small voice to the person beside him, that he had been trained to think in terms of objectives, and that this made him sometimes forget the body in front of him. The partner squeezed his hand and said, quietly, "Then learn the work of staying." The soldier looked at the plaque again, then at the horizon, and the two of them walked down the ridge toward town, talking about maps and about measures that had nothing to do with territory. The habit of staying is, in the end, something practiced by many hands and names. It is unglamorous and therefore more durable. It does not command large speeches, but it does reorient days. Jakob's family kept the photograph in a place where it could be seen at mealtimes. The letters, carefully preserved, were read on anniversaries and sometimes on random Sundays when the tea tasted like memory. The garden yielded its produce to neighbors and to the forgetful, and the bench under the maple became, for some, a place to resolve small, private decisions. This is not to say the world became gentle. There were crises and arguments and moments when the easy cruelties of bureaucracy or indifference reasserted themselves. New refugees came and found shelter. Elders died and the town mourned. Yet the story of the young man on the ridge, who had chosen, once, to keep a woman alive, had become a quiet grammar of response. It taught, in its modest insistence, that the moral life is often not made by sweeping acts, but by the constancy of small ones. A bowl given, a blanket folded in careful layers, the patience to stay awake and offer water. On the anniversary of the first unveiling, a small crowd gathered. Children, now older, recited lines they had learned in school about responsibility and kindness. A choir sang a straightforward hymn. Someone read from Jakob's letters, and the words seemed to cross the grass with the pace of footfalls. After the ceremony, people drifted away in clusters, speaking softly. Some placed new sprigs of rosemary at the plaque. Some left nothing, believing that silence could also be a kind of offering. That evening, under the sentinel branches of the maple, Jakob's granddaughter sat with her son, and told him a story she had not told before, of Mitchell standing in the dark, and of Katharina's steady breath, of the way a life can be kept by another who does not seek the language of heroism. The child listened, rapt, and then asked simply, as children do, what he could do now. She thought a moment, the weight of the years in her bones and the lightness of the world in her son's face, and answered with the clarity that had been taught to her by generations. Keep what you are given. Make the small thing next. They sat a while longer until the cool came and the stars were clear. The bench held them in a small public privacy. The plaque glinted faintly in the last light. Somewhere a door closed. A dog barked in the distance. The world, with all its complicated structures, continued to turn. But in a small town on a ridge, the art of staying continued, quietly taught and learned, passing from hand to hand like a useful object needed in the dark.